Welcome back, everyone. It's so good to be with you again as we keep exploring these principles of Christian living and spiritual growth together. Last time we were talking about faith, and I think that sets us up really well for what we're diving into today, meekness.
Yes, that's right. And we're actually picking up right where we left off with Ellen G. White's devotional My Life Today, specifically the entry for February the 21st.
I have to admit, when I hear the word meekness, I used to think of it as kind of being passive, or timid, almost like a weakness. But I've been studying this devotional, and I'm realizing there's so much more to it than I initially thought.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the devotional actually starts with a really powerful verse from Psalms chapter 25, verse 9. It says, "The meek will he guide in judgment, and the meek will he teach his way." So this really challenges our perception of meekness, as being powerless. It suggests that true meekness is actually about being receptive to God's guidance, allowing him to lead us.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so before we go any further, let's just take a moment to think about this. What comes to mind for you when you hear that word meekness? For me, it used to be those images of being a pushover or, letting people walk all over you.
Right, and that's a common misconception. You see, historically, and even in our culture today, strength is often associated with being loud or assertive or even aggressive. But the Bible paints a very different picture. True strength, the strength that comes from God, is often quiet and enduring. It's about leaning on Him and not on our own understanding.
So how does this devotional define meekness? It uses some pretty powerful language.
Well, it says that meekness is a precious grace, willing to suffer silently, willing to endure trials. Meekness is patient and labels to be happy under all circumstances. Meekness is always thankful and makes its own songs of happiness, making melody in the heart of God. Meekness will suffer disappointment and wrong and will not retaliate. So this really paints a picture of meekness as an active force.
I am struck by the phrase, labels to be happy under all circumstances. That just seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like, how can we be happy even when things are really tough?
Well, it goes back to that idea of finding our strength in God. True happiness, the kind that endures, isn't based on external circumstances. It's about cultivating this inner peace and contentment that comes from knowing that God is in control even when life throws us curveballs.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One part of the devotional that really resonated with me is where it talks about young people today. It says, "This precious grace is rarely seen in the youth of the present day, even in those who profess to be Christians. Their own ways seem right in their eyes. In accepting the name of Christ, they do not accept his character or submit to wear his yoke. Therefore, they know nothing of the joy and peace to be found in his service." This seems like a real wake-up call, especially for younger generations.
It is. It's easy to get caught up in, chasing our own dreams and ambitions, to think we know what's best for our lives. But the truth is, true joy and fulfillment come when we surrender our will to God's will, even when his plan doesn't align with our own. Think about Moses. He was leading a pretty comfortable life in Egypt, but ultimately chose to follow God's call, even though it meant facing incredible challenges and uncertainty.
That is a great example. And choosing God's way might not always be the easiest path, but it leads to a much deeper and more lasting sense of purpose. And Moses was definitely not a pushover, was he? Leading the Israelites out of Egypt took incredible courage and resilience.
Exactly. And his story highlights how true meekness isn't about being passive, but about having this inner strength that's rooted in faith and trust in God. It's that inner strength that allows us to endure trials, to forgive those who wrong us, and to keep moving forward even when things get tough.
And the devotional goes on to paint this beautiful picture of how Jesus exemplified this principle of meekness. It says, "It is not the seeking to climb to eminence that will make you great in God's sight, but it is the humble life of goodness, of fidelity, that will make you the object of the heavenly angel's special guardianship." The pattern man lived nearly 30 years in an obscure Galilean town hidden away among the hills. All the angel host was at his command, yet he did not claim to be anything great or exalted. He was a carpenter working for wages, a servant to those for whom he labored, showing that heaven may be very near to us in the common walks of life, and that angels from the heavenly courts will take charge of the steps of those who come and go at God's command.
This is a powerful reminder that true greatness isn't found in worldly success or status. It's about humbly serving God and others, just like Jesus did.
I know I personally struggle with this sometimes. It's so easy to get caught up in the pursuit of achievement and recognition. But Jesus' life shows us a completely different way. He had all the power and authority in the universe, but chose to live a life of humility and service. That's a pretty radical example of meekness in action, don't you think?
It is. It challenges us to rethink our priorities, to ask ourselves what truly matters in life. Are we chasing after worldly accolades, or are we focused on building God's kingdom?
That's a great question for us all to consider. Now, before we move on, there's one last quote from the devotion I want to highlight. It's actually from Christ's Object Lessons, and it says, "The perfect fruit of faith, meekness, and love often matures best amid storm clouds and darkness."
Wow, that's such an interesting point, We often associate growth with sunshine and abundance, but this quote reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful fruits of the Spirit, they develop during times of difficulty and hardship.
Yeah, it's kind of like a diamond forming under intense pressure, right? The pressure isn't necessarily pleasant, but it produces something incredibly valuable.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights how meekness can be that strength that helps us navigate those challenging times. It's about having the resilience to bend without breaking, knowing that God is working in us, even through the storms.
I've been thinking about how this idea of finding strength in meekness plays out in everyday life. For example, let's say you're dealing with a difficult coworker, someone who's constantly critical or undermines your work. It'd be easy to get defensive or even retaliate, but the principle of meekness challenges us to respond differently.
Yes, absolutely. It's about choosing to react with patience and grace, even when it's incredibly hard. And it's not about being a doormat or letting people take advantage of you. Instead, it's about finding that inner strength that comes from knowing your worth is found in Christ, not in the opinions of others.
That makes me think about Jesus' teachings on turning the other cheek. It's so counterintuitive to our human nature, isn't it? We want to fight back to defend ourselves when we feel attacked.
It is countercultural, that's for sure. But that's the beauty of meekness. It's about rising above those natural instincts and choosing a higher path, a path that reflects the character of Christ.
So how do we actually put this into practice? It's one thing to talk about meekness in theory, but how do we live it out, in those everyday moments of frustration or conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it starts with recognizing that we can't do it on our own. We need to lean on God's strength, to ask Him to help us respond in a way that honors Him, even when our emotions are telling us to do otherwise.
Yeah, and maybe it's about taking a pause before reacting, praying for guidance and wisdom in those difficult situations.
Exactly. It's about choosing our battles, wisely discerning when to speak up and when to let things go. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply silence and prayer.
I love that. Silence and prayer. It's about finding that quiet confidence that comes from knowing that God is in control.
And it's about trusting that He will fight our battles for us, even when we don't see how.
You mentioned the importance of prayer, and that makes me think about the verse we started with from Psalms. It says that God will guide in judgment and teach His way to the meek. It's like He's saying that if we humble ourselves before Him, if we're willing to be taught, He'll show us the way.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Meekness isn't about suppressing our own thoughts or opinions, but about being open to God's perspective, to His way of doing things.
And that openness can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves, of others, and of God's plan for our lives.
Absolutely. It's a journey of continual surrender and growth, a process of letting go of our own ego and embracing a life that's centered on Christ.
As we've been talking about this, I've been thinking about all the different areas of life where meekness can make a difference. It's not just about those big moments of conflict or adversity, It's about how we approach our relationships, our work, even our daily interactions with others.
You're so right. Meekness isn't just an outward behavior. It's an inward attitude, a way of being in the world. It's about choosing humility over pride service, over self-promotion, and forgiveness over bitterness.
And I think that's what makes it such a powerful and countercultural virtue. In a world that often values assertiveness and self-promotion, choosing meekness is a radical act of faith and trust in God. Yeah, it really is a different way of approaching life. And as we wrap up our conversation on meekness, I want to go back to something you said earlier about finding joy even in those difficult circumstances. How does meekness help us cultivate that kind of deep, abiding joy?
Well, I think it goes back to that idea of surrender. When we're constantly striving for our own way, when we're so focused on what we want and how we think things should be, well, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. But when we surrender our will to God's, when we trust that He knows what's best for us, even when we don't understand it, that's where true peace and contentment come from.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about letting go of that need to control everything and trusting that God is working all things together for our good.
Exactly. And that trust frees us to experience a deeper level of joy, a joy that's not dependent on our circumstances, but rooted in our relationship with God.
So as we're bringing this conversation to a close, I want to leave our listeners with some practical takeaways. If someone is listening and they're thinking, okay, I get it, meekness is important, but how do I actually start living it out? What advice would you give them?
That's a great question. I think it starts with small steps. Maybe it's choosing to respond with patience instead of anger the next time someone cuts you off in traffic. Or maybe it's offering forgiveness to someone who's hurt you, even though it's hard.
And remembering that we don't have to do this alone. We can always turn to God for help.
Absolutely. Prayer is so important. Asking God to cultivate meekness in our hearts, to help us see situations from His perspective, and to give us the strength to respond in a way that honors Him.
I love that. Prayer, small steps, and remembering that God is with us every step of the way. Well, this has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope this discussion has challenged you to think differently about the concept of meekness and inspired you to cultivate this powerful virtue in your own life.
And remember, it's a journey. Don't get discouraged if you stumble along the way. Keep leaning on God's grace, and He'll help you grow.
That's right. Keep practicing, keep praying, and keep seeking His guidance. And as always, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode where we'll be diving into another important aspect of Christian living.
Let's close with a prayer. Dear God, thank you for reminding us that true strength is found in humility and surrender. Help us to cultivate meekness in our hearts and to live it out in our daily lives. Guide our thoughts, our words, and our actions that we may reflect your love and grace to the world around us. Amen.